It started when my brother and I both found ourselves going through painful breakups around the same time. We were each trying to deal with the emotional aftermath of what felt like the end of our worlds. My brother Eden had been in a long-term relationship that ended suddenly, and I, too, had been heartbroken by a betrayal I never saw coming. We had been so close growing up, so it felt natural to lean on each other for support during this difficult time. We both needed someone who understood what we were going through, someone who wouldn't judge or push us to move on too quickly. And in a way, we both found solace in that shared experience. We'd often spend nights together, talking about our exes, trying to figure out what went wrong. It felt like a strange kind of therapy, talking about our heartache with the person who knew us best. There was something comforting in knowing that we weren't alone in our pain. But as the weeks went by, I noticed something in Eden that unsettled me. His pain seemed to intensify in a way that made me feel like he wasn't just dealing with a breakup, there was something else going on beneath the surface. I wasn't sure if it was because he'd always been the more emotionally closed-off one, or if the breakup had affected him more deeply than I realized, but it was like he was slipping into a different state of mind. It wasn't just sadness, it was something darker, something I couldn't put my finger on. And despite how broken we both were, I never could have predicted the betrayal that was coming. I thought we were just two siblings trying to pick up the pieces of our broken lives together, but Eden's behavior started to shift in small, subtle ways. He began to seek out my company more often, even when he didn't seem to need emotional support. We'd have long conversations, and I'd notice how he would look at me differently, like he was studying me. It was the kind of look that made me feel uneasy, like I was more than just his sister, and yet I couldn't shake it off. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that my emotions were clouding my judgment, but the way he acted around me began to make me question everything. Looking back, I can see how the seeds of betrayal were planted during those days. What started as innocent conversations and shared pain slowly morphed into something I didn't understand. I never thought my brother, the person who was supposed to protect me and be there for me, would ever cross that line. But as time passed, I couldn't deny the growing sense that something wasn't right. Even then, I didn't want to believe that Eden, someone I loved and trusted, could ever hurt me in such a way. As weeks passed, Eden and I spent more time together. We'd often hang out at the house, watching movies or talking for hours about our past relationships. It wasn't unusual for us to get close emotionally. We had always been close as siblings, but I noticed that Eden started to behave differently. His pain seemed to linger longer than I had expected, and instead of just needing comfort, he seemed to be leaning on me in a way that felt more intense than before. He began to act more protective and affectionate, in a way that felt a little off. He'd sit closer to me on the couch, his arm brushing against mine in a way that didn't seem to fit the situation. Sometimes he'd pull me into a hug that lasted longer than what I was used to. I felt a flicker of discomfort but brushed it off as him just being more emotionally vulnerable. After all, we were both grieving, and I thought it was natural for us to seek comfort from each other. But as the days went on, I started to notice other small things that didn't sit right with me. He'd give me these lingering looks, glances that seemed to last just a little too long, like he was looking past my eyes, as if seeing something deeper, something I couldn't quite understand. When I'd catch him staring, he'd quickly look away, but it made my heart skip a beat every time. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, that maybe I was too caught up in my own pain to think straight. But after a while, it became harder to ignore. It wasn't like him to act this way. Eden had always been the type to keep his emotions close to his chest. He wasn't the type to share personal feelings or get too close physically, especially not with me. So why was this happening now? He started doing things that felt like too much, like when he'd touch my arm a little too long when comforting me or rub my back when I'd confide in him about my struggles. I could tell he was trying to help, but his touch felt different now. It wasn't just comforting, it felt possessive, like he was trying to claim a part of me that I wasn't ready to give. Every time I tried to brush it off, the feeling stuck with me, lingering like a knot in my chest. I started to wonder if I was reading too much into it, but deep down, something told me it wasn't just my imagination. There was something more going on, something that I couldn't put into words. The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him about it. I didn't want to confront the possibility that my brother might be crossing a line. But the more time we spent together, the more I began to feel trapped in my own confusion. I had always trusted Eden, always believed that he would never do anything to hurt me. But now I found myself questioning that trust, unsure of whether I could really rely on him the way I always had. And even though I tried to distance myself, it felt like every moment I spent with him was pulling me further into something I wasn't ready to face. One night, after a particularly hard day, Eden invited me over to his place. He told me he wanted to talk. He'd been feeling more isolated lately, and I could sense that he really needed someone to lean on. It seemed innocent enough, so I agreed. He had always been the kind of person who kept things to himself, so when he opened up, I knew it must have been weighing on him heavily. I didn't think much of it at first. We'd spent so much time together already, supporting each other through our breakups, and it felt natural to continue. But that night, everything changed. As we sat down to talk, the conversation shifted to our shared pain. We started getting more personal, diving into the deeper parts of our emotions, the stuff we hadn't talked about before. It wasn't unusual for us to open up to one another, but this time felt different. The air between us felt heavier, like there was an unspoken tension. We talked for hours about our exes, about the things we regretted, the things we wished we had done differently. It was cathartic, but there was something in Eden's tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made me feel vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to. Then, in the middle of it all, Eden's hand reached out to touch my face. It was gentle at first, as if he was trying to reassure me, but it lingered a little too long. I froze, unsure of what to do, trying to process why his touch felt so different now. The warmth of his hand on my cheek was too intimate for the moment, and I pulled back slightly, my mind racing. But instead of pulling away, Eden seemed to lean in closer. He spoke in a softer tone, almost like he was trying to comfort me, but the words felt like they were meant to draw me in more than anything else. The whole situation felt so confusing, part of me wanted to pull away, but another part felt like I couldn't. The moment stretched on, and before I knew it, he was closer than I'd ever imagined he would be. His hand moved to my neck, and the way he looked at me made my heart race, my thoughts spinning. I didn't know how to react. The logic in my brain screamed for me to push him away, to stop everything from going any further. But the emotional part of me, the part that was still reeling from the loss of my own relationship, felt like I needed his closeness, even if I didn't understand why. It didn't take long before he kissed me. The moment was overwhelming, and I couldn't think straight. Everything in me screamed that this was wrong, that this wasn't how things were supposed to go between us. But I was too stunned, too caught up in the confusion of it all, to do anything about it. The line between comfort and something much more intimate had been crossed, and I didn't know how to stop it. The feeling of betrayal started to creep in almost immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away, to make it stop. I felt trapped in the moment, as if I had no control over what was happening. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a part of me had been stolen. I didn't know what to do, what to say, or even how to process what had happened. My mind was clouded with confusion and guilt, and the weight of what had occurred hung over me like a dark cloud. I kept replaying the events of the night before, trying to make sense of it all, but the more I thought about it, the less I understood. I tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, that I had just been vulnerable in the moment and had gotten caught up in it. But the truth was harder to face. I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had been broken, something I couldn't ever fix. I tried to act normal around Eden, but the silence between us felt suffocating. He didn't acknowledge what had happened, not even in the smallest way. It was as if nothing had changed, and that only made everything worse. His behavior toward me didn't shift. He still acted as though we were just two people helping each other through tough times. But I couldn't pretend. I couldn't just erase what had happened, what he had done. I could feel the guilt eating away at me, and every time I looked at him, it was like I was seeing him in a completely different light. How could I trust him again? How could I look at him the same way after everything? I was angry at him, but I was also angry at myself. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. I should have stopped it before it went too far, before I let him cross a line that we could never uncross. But in that moment, when it mattered most, I had frozen. I had allowed it to happen, even if I didn't fully understand why. The emotional turmoil was unbearable. I wanted to yell at him, ask him why he'd done what he did, but I couldn't find the words. Every time I tried to bring it up, I felt like I was drowning in shame, unable to confront the reality of what had happened. I could see how Eden acted like nothing was wrong, how he went on with his life as if our bond hadn't been shattered. But I knew it wasn't the same for me. The damage had already been done. It wasn't just the physical act that hurt, it was the betrayal of my trust, the realization that the person I had always relied on for support had used me in the most intimate way. I couldn't escape it. The thoughts kept haunting me, and with each passing day it felt like the weight of what had happened was growing heavier. The guilt, the shame, the confusion, they all wrapped themselves around me, suffocating me. I felt like I was suffocating under the burden of knowing the truth but not being able to speak it. The betrayal was too much to bear, and yet, it seemed like no one would understand. How could I explain it to anyone when I could barely understand it myself? As time passed, the truth sank in. Eden had taken advantage of my vulnerability during one of the darkest moments of my life. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply he had manipulated me, how carefully he had lured me into a situation I never should have been in. What happened that night wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate act, one that he had made with full awareness of what he was doing. The worst part was that I hadn't seen it coming. I had trusted him, believed that he was my safe space, the person who would never betray me. And yet, in that moment, he crossed a line I could never uncross. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about the physical act, it was the fact that it was my brother, someone I loved and trusted, who had done this to me. He had used my grief, my pain, to manipulate me into something I wasn't ready for, something I didn't want. I wanted to scream at him, confront him, but I couldn't find the strength to say anything. It felt like I was drowning in a sea of guilt, shame, and anger, with no way out. Every time I saw Eden, every time he acted as if nothing had changed, the weight of it all crushed me even more. It was as though he was pretending nothing was wrong, as though the betrayal never even happened, and that made everything even worse. The silence between us became unbearable. I couldn't pretend everything was fine, couldn't ignore the fact that something deeply wrong had taken place. But I also couldn't bring myself to speak about it, to confront him with the truth. I was terrified of what might happen if I did. Would he deny it? Would he try to justify his actions? I couldn't bear the thought of him trying to explain it away, as if it were somehow acceptable. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The constant weight of the betrayal was eating away at me, and I felt like I was losing myself in the process. I felt trapped. I couldn't talk to anyone about it, not without feeling like no one would believe me. How could I explain what happened? How could I make anyone understand the depth of the hurt I was feeling? Even though I knew that what Eden did was unforgivable, I still found myself questioning everything, my actions, my feelings, my ability to trust again. It felt like the whole world was shifting beneath me, and I had no idea how to find my footing again. The worst part was that I knew I would never be able to look at Eden the same way. The trust I once had in him, the bond we shared as siblings, was gone. That part of me would never come back, and it hurt more than I could ever explain. The betrayal wasn't just a one-time thing, it had broken something inside me, something I would never be able to repair. Every time I thought about it, I felt a sharp ache in my chest, a constant reminder of how deeply I had been hurt. And as much as I tried to move on, to put it behind me, I knew that it would haunt me forever.